Hi there, looking forward to another video today with you about a topic that's very important and often in the media these days, and it's the fact about environmental action when it comes to climate versus weather. This is a very key distinction. Climate change is a huge issue. It's in our media pretty well every day. It's part of elections. It's becoming an election issue, both in Canada, the United States, and other countries as well. And so we need to talk about the distinction between climate and weather, because it's critically important to understand that there is a real distinction. Climate is the term for the averaging of atmospheric conditions, or weather, over longer periods of time. And some variables with that are temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, wind, and precipitation. And also, a contributing factor to climate is location, latitude and longitude, the terrain, the altitude, and the use of the land, and also, very importantly, the access to nearby bodies of water. These are all factors when it comes to defining what climate means. Emphasis on longer periods of time as we go through. We're going to discuss that more. Now we take a look at what is weather, and that's different. Weather is the state of the atmosphere, hot or cold, wet or dry, calm or stormy, clear or cloudy. And most weather occurs in the lowest layer of the atmosphere, and therefore weather refers to the day-to-day temperature, the precipitation, and other atmospheric conditions, the day-to-day temperature. So we've seen these are two very important definitions. They're also distinct from one another despite despite the fact that they are obviously inextricably linked. So let's boil this down for a bit. Water cooler. People look outside and say, my goodness, I don't remember having snow this early in October. And we actually had some snow here in Calgary. And it's still on the ground, which is unusual because often what happens is the snow melts here, not long after it falls in this time of the year. So people will say, my goodness, there's snow on the ground. It's sticking. Oh, so much for global warming. That can't be climate change. We're getting snow in October. What's very interesting is that's a weather event. And we've just defined it, haven't we? That's a set of conditions that came together to create weather for a particular period in time, day, couple days, when the snow is going to stay. But the overall climate becomes a series of weather events that add up to a long period of time, which is defined as what the climatic conditions are for a certain area. What we do know is that we've had incredibly dry weather here, not unlike a lot of other jurisdictions. We had major forest fires near the mountain areas. And so all these things are not weather events. These are the combination of a lot of days, of a lot of period of time when conditions begin to really change. And that's what we're seeing. And the important thing to remember about climate change and the term global warming, what we have to remember about that is as some areas warm on the planet, some areas are actually going to get cooler on the planet. And that's something to keep in mind. Now we look at what the evidence is. What is the evidence? When we go to the ballot box or we hear these commercials from different companies and they're talking about climate change and they're talking about their commitment, well, what's the evidence that there's something going on with the climate? Well, weather events become more frequent and severe. A major climatic change involves a series of weather events which become more severe and become more frequent and become more measurable, okay? And so this is really important to remember that the weather events, the cumulative effect of that is one indication that the climate is changing. Also, we have to look at the totality of a region that's impacted. We see changes to the terrain via erosion. We see changes to vegetation and things that are able to grow in growing seasons. And also, obviously, a big impact is in the bodies of water to which that region is close by. So lakes or the ocean or rivers, creeks, all these things begin to change and have a dramatic effect on the land and what the response of that land is to the changing climate around it. Now, the other thing is, remember when we talked about weather, we discussed the fact that these are changes that are occurring in the atmosphere, in the lower atmosphere, and this is what happens with different weather events. What happens with climate change is we begin to see major changes in upper atmospheric changes. This becomes an issue when we see things happening up in the upper parts of our atmosphere, and that often leads to far more severe events. Think about if you've been in a prairie thunderstorm and you see these massive, massive clouds rising up with huge, huge thunder tops on the top of them. As we see more and more of these kind of things happening in the upper atmosphere, because of what's happening with the climate, this becomes a definite issue. Now, overall climate is changing, and again, like I said previously, what's important to take a look at is that it's changing over time, and that the change over time becomes measurable. This is really critical because, like we discussed, weather's an event. Happens, that's the weather. The weather for today is sunny, or the weather today is rainy. But what happens is, as the overall climate changes, this is something that's occurring over a definitive and measurable period of time. It's not just one event. Oh, yep, today it snowed, and I'm not used to seeing snow in September or October, or whatever the case may be. Another key factor in identifying change to the climate is that there's marked change in the precipitation. Either a lot more and a lot more violent. For example, flooding obviously becomes a big issue, or landslides, or in fact, the lack thereof of precipitation. We are now beginning to experience more desert conditions rather than wet and moist conditions. Interestingly enough, a lot of areas here in Western Canada, including Alberta and also down into the States, are beginning to see their climate change, obviously. And what we're seeing is now we're going from sort of a kind of almost a temperate zone in a sense, and now we're heading into a semi-arid zone. So we're having to take a look at different crops and different plants that we're able to grow, because we cannot necessarily rely on the moisture and the runoff from the mountains and the snow that we used to be able to rely on. And finally, yes, a crop failure or changes to the growing season. This becomes very critical. We're going to talk about that a little further here, but as we see these changes to the climate, we begin to notice that our growing seasons are changing. Often there's crop failure due to differences in the temperature, for instance, where what's happening is we're getting an earlier frost in some areas, and so therefore it kills off some of the plants prior. We're getting too much moisture, too little moisture, and we're having crops fail, and we're going to discuss that a little further here. Okay, climate change, and we're going to talk about where this hits us the most, and that's on the economic side. Inflation has been on the increase now for over a year, and so what we're taking a look at is the fact that as we move through these events that are occurring, and climate change and the issues that are occurring around us, one of the things as we begin to discuss inflation is obviously a key factor to that is food and food supply. And where's the supply coming from? And what are the costs of getting the food from the farm to our table? And so what we've seen is that there's definitely been an increase in pollution, and that has led to a real uptick in disease and sickness, and also long and short-term health issues. And so we see that because of the issues of pollution that have occurred, we know that we have these healthcare issues that have impacted us in a way never necessarily needed to happen if we had taken proactive steps to deal with some of this. So in the end, we have billions of dollars, probably trillions of dollars, in wasted healthcare costs globally. We do have global crop damage, like we discussed before, and when we have crop damage, this leads to disruption of supply. When we have disruption of supply of anything, okay, this is something we know and we learn in school, supply and demand, right? When you have a disruption of supply, then you have issues of higher costs that are being passed on, obviously, to the distributors and the suppliers. And then we know that they are now going to take those higher costs and they're going to translate that into higher costs for consumers. And so we see that when crops fail, it's not good, obviously, on many levels for the farmer, for the community, all those things. And that's a whole other side of the economic argument that can be made, because obviously if you're not getting paid for your crops, then now you have the issue of economic scarcity in a certain area. But it all begins to compound on itself. And when we look at it, that's how we end up with these bigger costs in the grocery cart as we move forward. And the other main factor on the food supply issue is that as we see the climate changing, we also begin to see seasonal changes. And that's resulting in non-traditional growing patterns. So we may not be able to grow the same things that we were growing before, or we have to think about how we're going to grow them differently. And often what ends up happening, especially in the case of growing crops, is there ends up being more pests of a different nature maybe than we had before, or at different times. And so now we're spending more money on irrigation, we're spending more money on fertilizer, spending more money on perhaps pesticides to wipe out the pests that are getting at these crops. All these things are extra costs that are being layered on because we're seeing this change in the climate. It's changing our food supply, it's changing the availability of food, and at the end of the day, we know that those costs have to go somewhere, and so they get passed on to us, the consumers, and that's where this becomes climate change really hitting us in our pocketbook, like they say. Here's another main factor about the economics of climate change, and that is, as sea levels rise, they begin to have a direct effect on cities. And many of the world's greatest cities, largest cities, but also historic cities of great value, are built on coastal areas. If you get a chance, you should go to the PBS website and watch the documentary Saving Venice. Unbelievable film that really highlights the issues of climate change and how they're affecting one of the most beloved cities on the planet. Venice is an incredible place with enormous amount of historical value, architecture and art-wise, but it's having a huge problem. We look to New Orleans as an example in North America of a city that is so well known, but is experiencing real climate issues. As they struggle with what's happening in terms of rising sea levels and the fact that they're just so low. Now, the cost of new climate resilient infrastructure, that's an issue. It's incredibly expensive. And what is also happening is the existing infrastructure that's there that may be the bridge to creating better climate resilient infrastructure. That infrastructure becomes vulnerable. It becomes broken or inoperable. And so now we have real issues because we know we have to get to point B, but we're at point A. Well, if point A begins to being wiped out, it's very difficult for us to make that bridge and transition. And so we really have to think about our infrastructure design, our costs, when it comes to the cities that are low-lying and at sea level that could be directly impacted. And you know, without throwing any numbers out there, because nobody can give you an actual number on it. Doesn't matter what, how good an actuary they are. They can't give you precise numbers, but we know that the costs of replacing the existing infrastructure and beginning to look at more climate resilient infrastructure, it's in the trillions, right? And so this is a gigantic number that we have to be prepared to face over the coming years. And the other cost that's really, quite frankly, incalculable is the cost of displacement of people and the business infrastructure and the societal infrastructure that underpins these cities that are so close to sea level and have issues in and around inundation from the rising sea levels. And when you just stop and think about it, I know there's been Hollywood films about it, and it seems like such a catastrophe in those, but it is. I mean, it's worse on the big screen probably, at least when we're looking at it, but imagine experiencing it. And we're already seeing that. We're seeing issues of flooding now becoming more severe in these cities. We're seeing issues of, in many areas, landslides, which are coupled with the flooding and the heavy rains and the rising of the sea level. And all these things go together to create an atmosphere that is obviously going to continue to become very difficult for society to exist and also for business and the economy to thrive. So this is an important video to present to you about these differences between weather and climate. They're significant, and we need to really understand that just because today's a kind of a weird weather day does not mean that the climate is not changing, that the global warming is an issue, that we need to be concerned about our greenhouse gas emissions. All these things are critically important to ensuring the health of the planet long term. And there are no quick fixes in this. There are no short-term band-aids that we can sort of slap on and go, wow, we dodged that bullet, okay? In terms of climate change, this is a significant issue that we need to start addressing. And as we talk about it in a corporate sense, in terms of our governance, we also need to be looking at what are we doing as a company? What are we doing as an organization to foster the evolution of how to respond to these climatic conditions? And we need to realize that this is with us now, it's going to continue to be with us, and we need to have an educated, remember, information. We need the information. We have to arm ourselves with real facts and real information of what the issues are so that we can have a proper response to them. Been great being with you today. I look forward to seeing you in our next video.